Hello and welcome to my personal ranking of all 22 bosses in Bloodborne from easiest to hardest. I should mention that I made this exact video after my first playthrough, but with more experience and having finally played the DLC, my list has changed quite a bit. I'm not going to include the Chalice dungeon bosses, sorry, they just make this video longer than necessary, and generally I don't play the Chalice dungeons due to their rather dull design. Before we start, I'd like to quickly mention that Bloodborne is quite possibly my favorite FromSoft game, and its insanely challenging bosses are certainly part of the reason why. Now let's jump in with number 22. There are actually very few bosses in Bloodborne that I'd say are easy, but the witches, yes there are actually two of them, are among the easiest in the entire series. I think this boss is more so meant to be a puzzle than a difficult battle, but it's not a particularly fun puzzle. When you walk in, your first thought will probably be that you're supposed to kill this lanky Slenderman looking beast, but the witch is actually hiding around the arena and it's only visible to you within a certain range. Once you find her, you'll realize that she takes damage like a sponge and barely puts up any fight. She can teleport around and perform an AoE that's easy to see coming, as well as a pathetic grab attack, but other than that, the only real threat in this fight is the parade of Slendermen in the middle. Once the second witch spawns in, she adds very little to an altogether drab boss. This is one of the few in the game that I've never actually died to. If the witches decide to be assholes and teleport every 5 seconds like they did for me, it might take a bit of time to defeat them, but as long as you steer clear of the sickle wielders, this fight should be a breeze. Welcome to the Royal Rat Vanguard of Bloodborne. Sorry to make the rather obvious comparison, but it's hard not to. In this fight you'll find yourself squaring off against a giant crowd of gelatinous blue trolls. One of these creatures is the boss, but you'll want to work on some crowd control while you're at it to avoid being overwhelmed. Eventually the boss will grow to a massive size and the result is rather intimidating. But don't let this wacky otherworldly being worry you, he's mostly a pushover. Large sweeping weapons are preferred for this fight so you can hit and stagger multiple targets simultaneously, but ultimately I wound up killing this boss before I could do much of, well, anything. The big guy may have increased attack range and strength, but this also means that you have a bigger target to focus on. Just don't get surrounded or pushed against a wall and you should have no problem crushing this emissary. For what is essentially meant to be the penultimate fight in the base game, the Wet Nurse is a rather disappointing fight. The aesthetics of the boss, the arena, and the unnerving music box that plays in the background are all on point, but the difficulty leaves much to be desired. The most recommended strategy for most beast enemies in Bloodborne is your key to success against this monster, and that strategy is to get behind her and beat away. Most of the nurse's attacks are locked into long combos, so you have plenty of time to dish out damage while she seemingly loses track of you. Some of her attacks hit pretty hard, but they're just so easy to avoid, and even if you are caught in some of her longer combos, it's usually not too difficult to roll out of it with your life. About halfway through the fight, she can summon the Dark Mist and clone herself temporarily to add some mild difficulty to the mix. The safest solution is to simply run around the arena until the mist dissipates, but I decided to just tank some damage and fight her at the same time as the clone. I wouldn't recommend this strategy, but the nurse still failed to kill me despite coming quite close at one point. If you play a bit more passive than me, I think you'll agree that this is one of the easiest fights in the game. The Living Failures sure live up to their name. These Frankenstein rejects are similar to the enemies that you face in the Celestial Emissary fight, but these ones are slower moving and hit a bit harder. They have a collective health bar so you can swap targets as you please to avoid being overwhelmed. Due to their slow speed and lack of difficult to dodge moves, I found the failures to be pretty easy to avoid. You do need to be mindful of your surroundings at all times to avoid the spells they can shoot at you, but their melee output is pretty pathetic. The failures do have one attack that calls in a colossal meteor shower, but there's an easy hack to avoid being hit by this. Just stand behind the conveniently placed structure in the middle of the arena and you're perfectly safe. The failures can't even attack you while they summon the meteors, so this move is rather useless unless you don't know where to stand. Sure, theoretically this boss can wreck you if you're caught sleeping, but as long as you watch your surroundings you shouldn't have any trouble. As the introductory boss to Bloodborne, the Cleric Beast is actually a pretty solid early game challenge. In fact, I'd say this is the point in the ranking where the bosses are at the very least mildly difficult. The beast itself has long sweeping attacks that have a large enough range to catch you if you don't learn the dodge timings quickly enough. In that sense, it's a nice tool to teach new players that the best place to stand while hunting beasts is behind them. That being said, this boss is pretty fast moving, so you can't just stand behind it and unleash the pain until it dies. You have to keep on your toes to prevent being swatted into the danger zone and subsequently pounded. This creature also tends to jump away from you if you remain out of reach for too long. This forces you to get good enough at dodging the attacks that you can get back there again to deal more damage. The main reason the Cleric Beast doesn't make it any higher on the list is that he's still quite easy to dispatch once you've played through the game once or twice. Still, I'll always remember overcoming Bloodborne's first real challenge and finally slaughtering my first beast. Man, I hate the one Reborn. This guy is so random that to this day I have no idea how you're intended to fight him. I suppose killing the Bell Maidens lining the balcony above would be a nice start, because if you don't, then they heal the boss. After that, I don't really have much advice to give, because not only does this thing look like a massive amalgamation of human corpses, but it behaves like one too. Its attack pattern is highly difficult to read due to the fact that the tells generally require you to change your camera angle, but usually you have enough of a chance to roll out of certain combos before you get obliterated. The biggest ones to watch out for are the Acid Diarrhea and the It's Raining Corpses move. Both of these moves managed to almost kill me. Still, I think an overall aggressive playstyle is enough to help you overcome this grotesque creature. The one Reborn is sort of like the Tower Knight from Demon's Souls. That is, if the Tower Knight sucked. I truly have nothing else to say about this one. Just bring some fire paper and try to end it as quickly as possible. Much like the one Reborn, I hate MICOLASH. This guy might be the most trolly boss in the entire game. Clearly FromSoft wanted to try something a bit different here, but I'd say it was a failure overall. Unless you know exactly what path to take, you're most likely going to spend upwards of 5 minutes chasing this guy around in a labyrinth of hallways filled with tanky skeleton mannequins. Your goal is to corner him in a dead-end room, and you have to do this twice in the fight, so have fun. Once you do corner him, he's highly vulnerable to fast-swinging weapons that can stun-lock him to oblivion. I should mention that you'll also want to kill the 2 skeletons in the room, because I actually died pathetically once trying to fight around them, and they might actually deal more damage per hit than MICOLASH himself does. MICOLASH does have a few different moves once you're fighting him. The first one is Augur of EBRIETAS. He uses it a lot and it hurts pretty bad, but you can easily sidestep to avoid it and continue the beatdown. He can also punch you with his bare fists. Needless to say, this doesn't do a whole lot. The move you really need to watch out for in the last phase is a Call Beyond. When he rears up to perform this spell, you need to back off and be ready to dodge some seriously deadly spells to avoid being one-shotted. MICOLASH isn't horribly difficult, but I do find him to be considerably annoying. Ranking this boss was actually kind of tough to do, considering you can either fight him early in your playthrough in the Hippogean Jail, is that how you pronounce it? Shit, I don't know. Or you can do it in the Unseen Village a ways ahead. If you try to face him early on, you'll likely have a tough time outputting enough damage to stagger him, because let's face it, if you do have a strong enough weapon to knock his legs out from under him consistently, PAARL's pretty much a joke. Sure, his legs are scrawny and tough to hit, but heavier weapons make short work of him before he can do too much damage to you. If you don't down him quickly though, I should mention that his attacks are quite tough to dodge and tend to hit hard. And me being terrible at recognizing the windups means I almost always get hit by his stupid electric AoE. PAARL also jumps around a lot, so locking onto him is not recommended. The camera is every bit as much an enemy as the beast itself. Still, if you fight PAARL in the Unseen Village after you've managed to level up a bit, I'd say he's pretty unlikely to give you too much trouble. The secret final boss in Bloodborne sure is cool looking and fun to fight, but I wouldn't exactly call him difficult. For one thing, this is the last boss you will face in every playthrough in which you consume the 3 umbilical cords, so you're going to be facing him at your most leveled point. I feel like this boss would be much more threatening if its attacks did more damage. Sure, some of them are tough to see coming, but the amount of damage they deal is more akin to something you'd expect to see around the midpoint of the game. From my perspective, the Moon Presence only really possesses 2 moves that are dangerous. The first one is an area-wide health drain that brings you down to 1 HP. What makes this counterable is that the beast remains practically motionless for some time after performing this, giving you ample time to slice and dice your health back up or chug a few blood vials. The other move is one that actually prevents you from healing for a short time. Thankfully he doesn't do this very often, but it did actually lead to my death once. If you are hit by this, just do yourself a favor and back off for 30 seconds or so. Truth be told, I didn't even know he could do this until my most recent run. which should tell you that as long as you're aggressive enough, the moon presence is unlikely to hit you with this before you manage to slay it. Hands down the largest boss in the game, the AMYGDALA fight is quite the cinematic experience. Similar to bosses like Dark Eater Martyr, AMYGDALA only takes notable damage to the head and front arms. This prevents you from following the golden rule of beast fights, but it also makes the experience much more exhilarating. I found the best thing to do is to bait the attacks and dive in to deal damage to the head during the cooldown windows. Be careful though, because AMYGDALA hits pretty hard and can even kill you in one swift combo depending on your vitality level. This boss also joins the club of bosses that can self-mutilate thanks to the inspiration of the last giant from Dark Souls 2. This gives the beast increased attack range, so at this point the best thing you can do is simply memorize its attacks as best you can and take advantage of the windows you're given. If I'm being honest though, I certainly didn't memorize this boss's moves very well, and I still managed to beat it on my first try. So I'd say the midpoint of the list is a good place for it to stand. I should mention that I usually save AMYGDALA for late game so that my vitality is a bit higher. This is a really cool boss, but still mid-level in terms of difficulty. Much like Cleric Beast, VICAR AMELIA is a boss that basically requires you to learn the golden rule of beast hunting. Most of her attacks involve powerful fist slams that can eviscerate early game health bars. Staying behind her allows you to deal damage while avoiding most of these attacks. The other challenge here is that this is one of the first bosses you face in the game that has a pretty massive health pool, at least if you haven't leveled your weapon much. In addition to this, the beast can heal herself towards the end of the fight, and if you don't have the proper damage output to counter this, you'll find yourself in an uphill battle. Still, her attacks are quite manageable, and fire is a major weakness against this monstrosity. If you have enough fire paper to keep your weapon coated through the entire fight, you can cause her to stagger quite a bit. I've read that a lot of people don't like this boss, but I think her design is actually quite nice. Honestly, I wouldn't mind if she was a bit harder to beat, but I still find the battle to be enjoyable enough. This might boil down to my own personal preference, but I'm not a fan of the shadows of YHARNAM. Ganks with 2 enemies are bad enough, but 3 just seems like a bit much. The toughest part of this fight is exactly what you'd expect it to be: managing 3 strong enemies while trying to deal damage yourself. It's recommended that you go after the katana wielding shadow first, as he's the one that will stick to you like glue. Thankfully, he's quite weak to parrying, so equip yourself some quicksilver bullets for the easiest kill. Visceral attacks demolish their health bars, so this strategy can help you to bring the fight down to a 2v1 pretty quickly. Once this happens, it's really just a matter of picking your openings. Before long, the remaining shadows will grow snakes from their heads and gain a few rather annoying attacks, so do keep your damage output as high as possible. You'll want to watch out for the giant serpents they can summon in particular. In previous playthroughs, I died several times to that stupid move. Thankfully, it never happened to me in this playthrough. Part of the difficulty in this fight feels RNG related, which I hate. If the shadows are generous and don't all bombard you at once, you'll probably defeat them easily. But if they decide to be spammy assholes that have a love for snakes, then good luck, my friend. The most hated boss in Bloodborne might just be Rom the Vacuous Spider. I personally don't mind her, but I see why she is really annoying for some. Much like Celestial Emissary, this boss forces you to deal with a horde of common enemies in addition to the potato spider itself. But this time around, the minions can kill you in a millisecond. Seriously, one wrong move and you can get overwhelmed with these spiderlings. They're fairly non-aggressive, but there's just so damn many of them that it's difficult to find openings to attack Rom without them trapping you in with the arachnid. Rom herself will teleport and flop around a bit, but the main attack you need to watch out for from her is the meteor shower. This can decimate your health, or at the very least leave you in bad shape for the spider minions to do the rest, because let's face it, they are the real threat in this fight. I don't have much else to say about Rom. It's a rather straightforward duel given the boss's limited moveset and lack of unique mechanics. Still, I think it's safe to say we're now moving into the upper tier difficulty with the top 10 bosses on the list. Cleric Beast might be the first boss that most face in Bloodborne, but this psychotic hunter is the first mandatory one. If you aren't used to the game's fast-paced action and aggressive enemies, well, let's just say you'd better get used to it fast, because Father Gascoigne is one of the most relentless enemies in the entire game. Opportunities to attack and heal are few and far between, not to mention this guy has two completely different phases. The first one is your typical speedy hunter fight. Parrying is your best friend during this stage, but it definitely takes practice to get the timing down. Once you reach phase 2 at around 1/3 health, he morphs into a hulking beast. This is where his attacks start to dish out insane early game damage, and some of his combos seemingly go on forever. Thankfully, I can say from experience that panic rolling is often enough to give you some momentary reprieve, but unless you dodge around him, he tends to just keep charging you down. The reason that Father Gascoigne doesn't quite make it higher on the list is that parrying is perhaps a little too powerful against him. Visceral attacks deal a lot of damage and allow players with enough skill to end the fight in just 6 or 7 hits if you go parry only. I have a feeling that a lot of people will disagree with me putting the Skin Flat Beast this high on the list, but I have my reasons. Phase 1 of the fight isn't really that bad. The beast has a few basic swipes and pounces, all of which can be avoided by sticking to that ass, which, believe it or not, is actually more visually appealing than its face. Once again, parrying comes in quite handy if you'd rather meet the creature face to face, but that's a rather dangerous game to play. Eventually, the beast will initiate phase 2, in which it becomes more aggressive and gains a poison effect to its attacks. This phase is largely the same otherwise, just have some antidotes handy for the poison. But at around 30% health, the beast will let out another shriek, and it's at this point that standing near the creature automatically builds your poison meter. This is where the fight goes from 0 to 100 in the blink of an eye. I swear to God, the bane of my existence during this phase is the grab attack, which is basically a one-shot and killed me 3 times in this run. To a certain extent, it might actually be better to just heal through the poison if you have enough blood vials left, because you need to devote all of your focus to dodging the beast's attacks. So between the poison and the hyper-aggression that is not seen in most of the game's earlier bosses, I'd say this is by far the toughest of the early game content. Oh, how times have changed. During my first playthrough, Gehrman was my hardest boss by far. But after fighting him several times since, I've come to the realization that while he's still quite difficult, there are others that deserve a spot just slightly ahead of him. The fight itself is a bit similar to Father Gascoigne. Gehrman will alternate between one-handing and two-handing his weapon, which just so happens to be very similar in moveset to the Hunter's Axe. I find the first phase of this fight to be quite easy thanks to how telegraphed his attacks are and the fact that he can be parried once you learn the timing. Phase 2 is where he gives himself a buff and the fight becomes significantly harder. I'm not sure to what degree his moveset actually changes, but his combos hit harder and often stun lock you if you're unfortunate enough to get caught in them. There are a few new moves that I distinctly remember, such as the Tornado of Doom. While this phase is certainly much harder, I think my massive amount of practice fighting Gehrman has made the fight feel a tad bit easier for me upon replaying the game. But my most recent playthrough took place after a long break from the game, so he was not easy by any stretch of the mind. At the peak of Cainhurst Castle rests the second hardest boss in the main game, Martyr LOGARIUS. This is one of the few humanoid enemies in the game that you can't exactly face like most of the NPC hunters you're used to earlier in the game. LOGARIUS is far sturdier and staggers a bit less. He has an enormous arsenal of attacks, each with different parry timings, so I don't even really attempt that much, to be honest. From a distance, he mainly relies on homing skull missiles. These are easily handled by simply sidestepping to avoid their detonation. There are plenty of structures along the rooftop to use for blocking these as well. LOGARIUS' melee arsenal is what truly makes him challenging. He has one move where he leaps into the air out of sight and comes down with a massive swipe of his scythe. I always struggle to avoid this one, and getting hit by it means you're going to be very low on health when you stand back up. He can also plant a sword in the ground that causes you to be bombarded with projectile blades. I'd recommend destroying the sword immediately, because leaving it around for long is a death sentence. This is another optional boss, so obviously facing him later in your playthrough will make him a bit easier, but even then I've died to him many times in previous runs, even while fighting him later in my run. Actually, the first time I played through Bloodborne, I almost missed this area, not even really realizing that it existed because it's so hidden away, which sucks because this is a really cool boss. Lady Maria was one of the first hunters to be trained by Gehrman, and she certainly lives up to that billing. In fact, I'd argue she's a good bit harder than Gehrman. She's far more aggressive, has faster attack combos, and has a far larger health pool. She is still vulnerable to parrying, but I found it to be a bit less useful than it was with Gehrman. It's only really something I'd attempt in the first phase. Eventually, she becomes enraged enough to stab herself in the chest, using her own blood to enchant her blades for increased damage and range. She also gains new moves during this next phase that prove difficult to combat. Your best bet is to stay close to Maria and stagger her when possible. It's important to pick your openings carefully and watch out for her AoEs. I can see how it's really easy in this fight to burn through blood vials if you get caught in some of her nasty combos, so I'd actually argue to a certain extent that this is one of those bosses that just requires you to simply get good and learn how to dodge her attacks. Considering how many times I almost died, I certainly feel lucky beating this legendary beast hunter on my first try. There's no doubt in my mind that this is one of the best and most difficult in the entire game. As if Bloodborne needed to outdo itself, the first boss you face in the DLC is quite possibly my favorite in all of FromSoft's games. The cutscenes and dialogue are all perfection, and they help establish a feeling of dread as the fight begins. In addition to that, it should come as no surprise that the fight is also quite hard. Ludwig's first phase is similar to that of the blood-starved beast or VICAR AMELIA. Staying behind him is the best way to avoid being trampled or disemboweled by his many arms. Most of these moves are somewhat manageable, but this is a long fight. Managing your blood vials and avoiding taking damage are essential to winning. By far the most deadly attack during this phase is when he leaps into the air and after a short period pounces down with the force of a freight train. Dodging this attack is tough to pull off, and it could nearly one-shot me. Once you bring him to half health, you're subjected to one of the coolest cutscenes in all of gaming before facing Ludwig again, this time with his holy blade in hand. Phase 2 is equally badass, but I really can't offer much advice other than to get good and dodge the attacks. The fight will basically force you to do so because some of his attacks in this phase deal massive damage and can sometimes one-shot you. I actually almost beat Ludwig on my first attempt, but got caught off guard when he was on his last legs. Honestly, this only made me happy that I get another chance to face off with the accursed beast. This is just one of those bosses in the game that reminds me that all of this is worth it. And so we've come to the hardest boss in the main game. When facing EBRIETAS, there are basically two schools of thought. You can either face the tortured beast head-on for more damage, or follow the golden rule and chip away at her from behind. I've tried many times to fight her head-on, but every time I get my ass kicked. You pretty much have to be perfect with your dodges in order to beat her this way, and don't even get me started on that charge that, to the best of my knowledge, is totally unavoidable. So how is the fight if you stick to her ass? Well, it's a little easier I guess, but you deal less damage to her backside, so you'll have to stay alive for a lot longer. Most of EBRIETAS' close range attacks are manageable, but some of her tentacle swings can still hit you no matter where you are. At around half health, she gains a few new abilities, the first of which is a passive health drain that slowly eats away at you. This isn't too much of a problem, but if you don't keep a close eye on your health bar, you may wind up being lower than you think. The second new move is a Call Beyond, the spell that MICOLASH uses. Only here, it can straight up one-shot you if you don't see it coming and aren't ready to dodge it as soon as the tell comes. I can't tell you how many times I've died to this attack just moments before victory. Much like Ludwig, this is another fight that requires a lot of patience and stamina, both mental and physical. Bloodborne has a lot of tough bosses, but these top two assholes are honestly on another level. LAURENCE is so brutal that I almost gave up after just a few attempts, thinking to myself there's no way I could ever beat him. Why? Well, let's see what this upgraded cleric beast has in store for you. Insane aggression, fire explosions upon impact, difficult to dodge arm swings, two completely different phases, lava spewing from every body cavity, and a massive health pool. Did I cover everything? I mean, you might think I'm exaggerating, but for my first few attempts, I was literally out of blood vials before his health even dropped below 75%. It was at this point that I realized that I needed to change my strategy in order to outsmart this beast. And I did eventually beat him. Just to give you an idea, the attempt that brought me victory took over 11 minutes. Here's how I finally did it. During phase 1, you need to keep your distance. It can be tempting to roll behind Laurence and wildly swing your weapon at his booty, but I wouldn't recommend this unless your dodging skills are god tier. You'll want to try and bait him into doing punishable attacks, such as the triple fist pound. Headshots are an added bonus because they leave him open for visceral attacks. It doesn't matter how long this takes, your goal in this phase is to have plenty of blood vials left for phase 2, so be patient. Once this finally happens, his legs will explode into a giant pool of lava. At this point, I'd recommend once again staying away, but stick closer to his right shoulder as you're less likely to get hit there should you need to dodge behind him. From there, lead him back and forth from one end of the arena to the other and wait to attack until he breathes fire. This is virtually the only safe window to attack from my understanding. As I said before, this takes a ton of time to pull off, but it's really the only reliable way to succeed. If you do manage to bring Laurence down, I offer my congratulations because this guy is ridiculously challenging. There's something really ironic about the fact that the hardest boss in Bloodborne beats you senseless with his own placenta. But all jokes aside, I don't think anyone will be surprised to see the Orphan of Kos come in the top spot. I'd go as far as to say that this might just be the toughest boss I've personally faced in all of gaming. Take the health pool of Laurence, the aggression and attack strength of Ludwig, the mega combos of Lady Maria, and you still wouldn't have the deceptive beast that is this newborn abomination. I could seriously go on about what makes this guy near impossible all day, but it really boils down to the amount of damage his lightspeed attacks inflict. I also feel like a lot of them have a larger hitbox than you'd initially expect thanks to the juicy splatter his nasty sack makes when he slams the ground with it. The first phase is by no means easy, but it's more manageable than the second. In fact, I actually barely made it to the second phase during my first attempt, but I nearly lost my mind when I realized how aggressive the Orphan gets once those adorable little wings come out. I don't think I really need to explain it, especially if you fought him yourself. Quite honestly, there was a point during this fight that I promised myself I'd never give this fucker praise if I made a ranking video. That is, if I ever beat him. But upon reflection, I actually enjoy the insurmountable challenge the Orphan presents. Bloodborne is well known for its incredible design and difficult to learn enemies, and this boss is absolutely the embodiment of that. And I think it's safe to say that the DLC ends on quite the high note compared to the base game with the moon presence. Looking back on the Souls series, a vast majority of the bosses can be easily handled with enough practice, but this is one of the few that might just give me trouble forever. And there you have it, guys. That's my ranking of all 22 of the main bosses in Bloodborne. If you enjoyed the video, I would highly appreciate you leaving a like, and don't forget to post your ranking down in the comments. Keep on slaying beasts, and I will see you guys in the next video.